I bow to the great Mahavatar Babaji, to Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri, and my own Guru Paramhansa Yogananda, and my divine friend and guide Swami Kriyananda. Namaste friends, welcome to the second episode of this series, The Path of Kriya Yoga. In this series, we will be exploring this particular path of Kriya Yoga, the sacred meditation technique that was revived by Mahavatar Babaji in 1861 and that came to us through Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Shri Yukteswar Giri and Paramhansa Yogananda. And we are also exploring the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, of this particular path of self-realization, that's what we call it. How to live these principles in our own lives, how to apply these teachings during instances that we face in our day-to-day life. So I hope you're finding this series useful. After last week's episode, I received some emails from some of you and also comments on Facebook and YouTube with certain questions and thoughts. I hope to address some of that in this video. And if you do have thoughts, comments, suggestions, or questions, do write to me. I would love to hear from you and I would be happy to answer or address some of that in these videos. It always is helpful for us to have that conversation going so I know that what I'm saying makes sense to all of you. The topic of last week's video was spiritual evolution, anatomy, and astrology. An interesting combination of words, first of all, to start with. We looked at the idea of spiritual evolution. What does it mean to spiritually evolve? And we looked at the physical anatomy, but also more importantly, the subtle astral anatomy of the different chakras in the body and how they correspond to planets in the sky. That's where I think I went a little bit far off and I didn't think 30 minutes was sufficient. So I want to continue this video also on the same topic, part 2 of this same topic of spiritual evolution and astrology and anatomy, and expand on some of the things that I shared last week. I want to say, perhaps as a disclaimer before I even start this video, my objective in sharing these things and to talk about this subject is not to convince anybody, is to prove any point, especially address the skeptics in the room. That's a very, very tricky proposition. I'm not sure I would try that. First, we want to ask, what is science? What is scientific? Of course, there's the physical science or the empirical science, which works with the material plane. Everything that we can perceive through our senses, that we can hear, see, touch, all of those things, even when we are performing experiments with subatomic particles. I mean, scientists are performing experiments, not necessarily all of us. The results have to be observed in some kind of a physical form, either in a metallic plate or something that we can actually calibrate. And then, of course, there are a lot of mathematical equations that come in after that, and that helps us define what is true, what is not true, what's happening, what's not happening. Now, in that scientific framework, there is not enough space for a lot of things that are part of our daily experience, like our own feeling nature, our truth and our intuitive experience of what reality is. That kind of science cannot take all of that into account because these tend to be fairly subjective and individual. The yogic science, on the other hand, is much more comprehensive. It's all-encompassing. It takes into account all aspects of who we are. It does not ignore the physical science in the material plane. It just puts it in context in view of this much greater reality of the cosmos, of reality, of consciousness, and who we are in relationship to that. What are we doing in this world? All of that is clearly explained by the yogic science. And the intuition and the feeling nature of man is, of course, very subjective and individual, but there are a lot of common threads that tie us as human beings. More importantly, we are tapping into the intuition not of just any random individual, but these are teachings that are coming to us through avatars, through realized beings, through great saints who have experienced God, who have perceived truth without the mind that is beyond what we can understand with our limited capabilities. So when we look at these principles from the yogic science, we are looking at it through the eyes, through the worldview of these great enlightened beings. So it behooves us to take it seriously and see what from these teachings is helpful for us and how we can apply these in our own lives. That's what I wanted to say as a disclaimer for this video, because because we want to understand what it is that we are working with. We are not trying to be dogmatic or blind in believing in astrology or anything like that, but also these great masters and avatars are telling us that these planets affect our lives, that these chakras are why we experience things a certain way. Now we want to pit all of that against our own experience of reality, use our common sense and our intuition to see what works, what doesn't work, and then see what is true to our own experience of reality, and then use that as our guide in our own spiritual journey. So I want to encourage all of you to try that in all the truths I'm sharing with you, which are all based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Now, talking of astrology itself, it can be a tricky thing to convince people about. There is one thing that came to me when I was thinking about astrology and why it makes so much sense to me. I remember, I think in my first or second year of college, I was really into a lot of metaphysics and new age physics, more importantly. Things like quantum physics, relativity, and one of the things that I was studying at that time, just out of interest, these were not subjects I was specializing in college, but it was just my hobby. And I was reading this book on chaos theory. Maybe some of you know about this and maybe you have some experience. I have to say I am an expert by no means. I just remember vaguely some of the things that I read in those days. What I remember the most was how this theory was telling us that this universe is entirely non-linear. It is based on patterns of energy. It is not based on physical cause and effect as we understand it. And there was a lot of math involved in all of that, all of which was just going beyond my head. The part that really made a strong impression in me was the set of pictures in that book. In glossy print, I remember seeing all these pictures from nature of leaves, flowers, ocean waves, of trees, rocks, various things that we find in natural world, the beauty, the harmony and the symmetry of these patterns. How did these rocks arrange themselves in that way? Why does ocean wave form in this way? Why does a leaf look like that? And I remember reading about all of this. And to explain in brief, if you take a fern leaf, for example, it always expands in these patterns that we call fractals. That's the technical term. A fern branch has a central vein and it has leaves that extend as prongs on either side. And the same pattern reflects itself in each fern leaf. There's a central line and then there's all these leaves that go on the sides. And within each leaf, again, the veins propagate in that same fashion. There's a central line and you have these lines and prongs that develop on either side of it. You can go further and further down the subveins and even up to the cellular level. It is that same pattern that you will observe. And not only that, if you were to zoom out and look at the fern plant from a distance, you would see that the entire plant itself is reflecting a similar pattern. And not only that, even fern forests propagate in that way with a central line and to the sides. Now, what is it telling us? It is the simple truth that the parts are reflected in the whole and the whole is reflected in the parts. That's what chaos theory was teaching me, and at least that's all I remember of it right now. And coming back to our discussion on astrology, it is a very similar idea because it is all part of the natural world. We are part of the natural world. Now we come into this world with this pattern of energy, that suddenly expresses itself as a separate physical body at that moment of birth. And the same inner reality that we carry as energy within ourselves is also reflecting in the whole, the outer universe. That inner universe is reflecting in the outer universe. And at that moment of birth, that same pattern is what's reflecting in the sky as well, as patterns of energy expressed through the planets, as the positions of the different planets in the sky and the different zodiacs and all of that. So that energy that's inside of us is the same energy that is in the sky. So if we were to look at the sky and plot a map of these planets, it can give us a lot of valuable information of those same energies that are driving us from inside. Because that inner universe is a reflection of the outer universe, and the outer universe is a reflection of the inner universe. That's how life works. That's the principle of nature. And that's why we are working with these subtle teachings that are helping us go on a subtler and subtler level to get a better hold of energy, to be able to effectively use this principle and evolve more quickly in our own spiritual lives. Now, this principle, like I was describing last week, reflects in the chakras. There is a one-on-one correspondence with each planet reflecting its energy in one of the chakras in the astral body. The root chakra or Muladhara chakra reflects the energy of Saturn, the planet Saturn in the sky. The sacral chakra or Swadhisthana is reflecting the energy of Jupiter. The navel chakra, Manipur, or the lumbar center in the body, is reflecting the energy of Mars. And the heart chakra or Anahata, not surprisingly, is reflecting Venus. And the throat or Vishuddha is reflecting the energy of Mercury. And then there are 2 points, 2 poles to the sixth chakra that are separated even in the physical body. The prefrontal lobe is the positive pole of that sixth chakra called Agnya, and that is the sun. That is the planet sun reflected in our own astral anatomy. And this point, the medulla, is the negative pole of that same sixth chakra, which is the moon. So the sun and moon are the positive and negative poles of the sixth chakra. Now, oftentimes, both in Hindu religion, but perhaps even in other religions, when we perform rituals to the sun, when we worship, adore, and make offerings to the sun, it is part of an outer ritual where we are tuning into the sun god himself. But in essence, we are also tuning into the inner sun, which is that spiritual pole star, which is that point of Christ consciousness that can take us forward in our own spiritual journey. So it is a relationship which, when we take inside, these rituals and spiritual practices become much, much deeper because we start understanding them in their true essence. One of the most well-known and popular mantras of the Hindu faith is the Gayatri mantra. It goes like this: Om Bhur Bhuvaha Swaha Tat Savitur Varenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yonaha Prachodayat. This mantra is an affirmation of our desire for enlightenment, of self-offering into the sun. Oftentimes in India, when it's ritualistically practiced, we make offerings to the sun outside. But in essence, that sun is inside. In the practice of meditation, we are affirming that same desire for enlightenment, but we are offering it up to that spiritual eye, the inner sun. Tat Savitur Varenyam. Savitra is the word that is used in this mantra, the Sanskrit word, and that refers to both these aspects. It refers to the outer sun, if that's all we are working with, but in its true essence, in a subtler level, it's reflecting that inner sun. It's meaning that inner source of light, that point of Christ consciousness in our own astral spine, into which we are offering ourselves, we are offering our little ego. Another example I'll give you, especially from the Hindu faith, is oftentimes deities are represented with a crescent moon somewhere in the front, either on their head or crown or somewhere near the forehead. What that refers to, or what that's reflecting to us, is that they have brought this individual identity, that delusion of being separate, and united it with that sun. The sun and the moon being separate means that we are still in that delusion of thinking that we are separate from everything there is. Whereas in a God, in a deity, there is no such delusion of separateness. God is consciousness. So that moon has been united with the sun. They are no longer separate. They are no longer two separate poles with any tension between them. The Christ consciousness has been fully awakened, and all ego identity has been offered into it. That's what that moon in the front means, is that the moon has been offered into the sun. Now, what does all of this mean for the path of Kriya Yoga and our own spiritual evolution? There are 2 more planets I want to talk about, which makes this point even clearer for all of us. And these 2 planets in the Indian system are called Rahu and Ketu. And I think in the Western system, they're called the North Node and the South Node. Now, I'm not going to explain the physics, the astronomy of it, because it might just get us on a whole other track and a digression from the topic at hand right now. But you can also Google and see how the orbits of the sun and the moon and earth intersect with each other, and how there's an ecliptic. These 2 planets are actually reflecting the torque, the angular momentum that is created when 2 orbits collide. And this torque is what's reflected through Rahu and Ketu. Rahu is the point where the torque is the highest, and Ketu is the point where it's the lowest. That's all I will say, because that's a whole other discussion on physics, a subject in which I'm not an expert, but certainly you can look it up and you'll find a lot of information on that. What it means to us in our spiritual anatomy is that Rahu and Ketu are reflecting that tension that is keeping these two poles separate, the sun and the moon separate. And if you remember from our discussion last week, these 2 points, the ego identity and the separateness of feeling that I, me, myself, I want to take care of myself, I care about myself more than anyone else, versus this point of Christ consciousness, the prefrontal lobe, where we realize that our happiness comes from the happiness of everyone. We are, in fact, a part of all that is. The whole of spiritual evolution, spiritual progress, is moving from this negative identity into a place of positive identity, moving from this place of thinking that we are separate and we have to always take care of ourselves and defend ourselves for our survival, to this point of knowing that I am in fact part of God. I am part of all that is. I am one with God. So spiritual evolution is the journey of moving from here to there. And what's keeping us separate in our astral spine from making that progress is the tension between these 2 points, this torque that exists between the sun and the moon. And this, in our astral spine, is represented or reflected in 2 subtle nerve channels or currents that flow in the astral spine. They are called Ida and Pingala. And these 2 reflect Ketu and Rahu. They are the downward and the upward currents that go in the spine with every breath of air. In the next episode, I'm going to go into greater depth to specifically talk about the astral anatomy and these 2 nerve channels. For right now, I want to just mention this brief point that these subtle currents reflect that tension between the point of sun and the point of moon, the tension between that limited ego identity and the cosmic identity of feeling one with Christ consciousness. And in terms of astrology, they reflect in the 2 planets, Rahu and Ketu. So what does this all mean to the path of Kriya Yoga? Kriya Yoga is the path of neutralizing these 2 currents. Even in mythology and astrology, Rahu and Ketu are considered underground planets. They are considered demonic planets in Hindu mythology. What that simply means is that they reflect the subconscious. They reflect all that we bring into this particular moment from our past, all that we hold on to, both our desires and longings and regrets, but also fear, anger, frustration, all that we are storing and suppressing and holding on to as part of our past that is constantly influencing how we see the present. That's really what's reflected in the subconscious. And these 2 subconscious planets are those 2 currents of energy in our own spine, going all the way from the coccyx center, from Muladhara, to the spiritual eye and back with every single breath. They are in fact connected with that physical breath. Or a better way to say is the physical breath is a reflection of that flow of energy. Again, like I said, this video is also a little too brief for me to get into such deeper concepts of how the breath is connected with these currents and what they really reflect for all of us in the anatomy. I'm going to come to that in the next episode. I'm going to focus entirely on these 2 currents and another subtle channel, which is the key to our salvation. For this discussion, we do want to understand the role of Rahu and Ketu. And in the path of Kriya Yoga, what we do is we consciously start neutralizing these 2 currents. How do we do that? Krishna explained this in the 4th chapter of Gita, where he talks about offering the incoming breath into the incoming breath into the outgoing, and the outgoing breath into the incoming. That's really a gist of what the path of Kriya Yoga is. When we move energy in the spine through the practice of Kriya, through the sacred pranayam technique, what we are trying to do is to bring that Ida and Pingala closer and closer to its center, to neutralize that tension, to neutralize the delusion of separation from that central channel, our own source of salvation. Because when we are able to neutralize these 2 channels, we can completely neutralize and eradicate any tension between the sun and the moon. We can bring the moon up to the sun, which means we can dissolve that ego identity, that delusion of being separate and limited, and offer it up into that point of Christ consciousness. We can pierce that five-pointed star of spiritual eye and feel that unity with all of creation. That is the state of samadhi, which Yogananda ji describes in detail in the Autobiography of a Yogi. So I hope some of this made a little more sense. If not, do write to me if you want me to expand on any of these particular points, and I'll be happy to. I want to now read these lines again from the Autobiography of a Yogi that we looked at last week to make sense in terms of whatever I described right now with these different planets and the two subtle currents. This is what Yogananda ji says in the Autobiography. The Kriya Yogi mentally directs his life energy to revolve upward and downward around the 6 spinal centers, which correspond to the 12 astral signs of the zodiac, the symbolic cosmic man. Like I was saying, the 12 signs of the zodiac, I mentioned this in the previous video, are the 2 poles of each of the chakras. So when we are rotating energy throughout the entire spine, we are going through those 12 zodiac signs. We are moving energy through the 12 zodiac signs. Now, this goes back to the discussion on spiritual evolution. What happens in natural spiritual evolution is that as we live life with the right attitude, as we expand our consciousness, as we seek happiness and fulfillment in all the right ways, we grow spiritually. We become bigger and bigger. Our consciousness expands. And that happens over a period of time, and as sun transits these 12 zodiac signs, because as we are moving through time, this happens naturally because that instinct for growth and expansion is deeply implanted in our own soul, which is what is driving us forward. So we are growing spiritually even through everyday life because we are experiencing life in certain ways, certain life circumstances are coming to us, and they're all teaching us lessons that we need to learn. So this natural process of evolution is unfolding as sun is transiting through the 12 zodiac signs. Now in the Path of Kriya Yoga, as Yogananda ji explains it, we start transiting on a subtler level. We start moving energy and going through these 12 zodiac signs with every breath. With every breath, we start moving the energy throughout the astral spine consciously. Now, with every breath, even if we don't do Kriya, energy is going up and down Ida and Pingala. We will discuss this in detail next week. But when we start doing a practice such as Kriya, when we become conscious and we draw our energy inward and we practice this conscious technique of pranayam to control and direct that energy, we start moving through those 12 zodiacs and start progressing spiritually. And how do we progress spiritually? By expanding consciousness, that same expansion that comes by living the right spiritual life for a whole year. The same transit happens with every round of Kriya. With every round of Kriya, we go through those 12 zodiac signs with reference to the inner sun. If we were to only lead an outward life, even with the best of spiritual practices, even by right living and devotion and all kinds of austerities that might help us to grow spiritually, we are certainly working out a lot of our karma through life experiences. And over a period of time, like a year, we go through those 12 zodiac signs, the sun transits them, and we are different individuals at the end of it. But with Kriya, the same practice can be translated to the inner universe. Now we can move this energy through the 12 zodiacs without needing to live on this planet for that same amount of time. We can do it on a subtler level and we achieve the same amount of spiritual evolution. So that's why Yogananda ji goes on to say, 1/2 minute of revolution of energy around the sensitive spinal cord of man effects subtle progress in his evolution. That 1/2 minute of Kriya equals 1 year of natural spiritual unfoldment. So that's the theory or the principle behind why 1/2 minute of Kriya, which is essentially 1 round of the pranayam technique, equals 1 year of natural spiritual unfoldment. Now he goes on to say, I'm going to read further. The astral system of a human being with 6 inner constellations revolving around the sun of the omniscient spiritual eye, this is what I was describing earlier on in this particular episode, is interrelated with the physical sun and the 12 zodiacal signs. All men are thus affected by an inner universe and an outer universe. The ancient rishis discovered that man's earthly and heavenly environment in 12-year cycles push him forward on his spiritual path. The scriptures aver that man requires 1,000,000 years of normal, diseaseless evolution to perfect his human brain sufficiently to express cosmic consciousness. I'm going to read further because this part is so interesting. 1,000 Kriya practiced in 8 hours gives the yogi in one day the equivalent of 1,000 years of natural evolution. And then Yogananda ji goes on to propose some mathematics there. Now, the reason I read that passage is to bring our attention to another subtle point, which Yogananda ji almost glosses over in this paragraph, where he says, the ancient rishis discovered that man's earthly and heavenly environment in 12-year cycles push him forward on his natural spiritual path. What does that even mean? What does this have to do with the 12-year cycle? We are talking about the 12 zodiac signs, but how does that relate to 12 years? Now, that is related to the planet Jupiter. Now, the Jupiter as a planet takes 12 years to go around that sun, that source of energy. All these planets, they are physical bodies. That's how science sees it. These are large physical bodies, except Mercury, most of these, and Venus. Most of these planets are bigger than Earth, especially Jupiter and Saturn are really, really big, as most of you know. And these are all planets that are farther from the sun compared to the Earth. So they take a much longer time than 1 year to go around the sun. So Jupiter takes 12 years to go around the sun, go around its own elliptical. And what this 12 years represents is our own spiritual journey. Again, to read that particular sentence from the Autobiography. In 12-year cycles, push him forward on his natural spiritual path. Jupiter, in fact, in Sanskrit, he's called the Guru. He is the planet of spiritual growth and spiritual expansion. So this 12-year orbit that Jupiter is on is that 12-year cycle of attuning to the Guru, of that expansion of consciousness. And when this planet every time passes through that point, at the time of birth, Jupiter is at a given point in the sky, and every 12 years he crosses that same point. He pushes us into another growth spurt, into another stage of expansion. That's why people often say even great spiritual moments happen in life at the age of 12, 24, 36, 48, etc. No matter what your age is, you can look back at your life. 12 is a tricky age to say anything because we are not fully individualized yet. We are not taking our own decisions or making choices the same way as we would at the age of 24 or 36 or 48. So oftentimes, if you were to notice, you will see that a great spiritual impetus, assuming you're over the age of 24, if not, you can look forward to it very soon. At the age of 24, perhaps you had a significant moment in your own life where there was an inner shift because Jupiter crossed that point where there was a push of spiritual expansion, of growth. That's why Yogananda ji here is saying the ancient rishis discovered that this happens in 12-year cycles, and this 12-year cycle is that one revolution of Jupiter around that sun. Now, in the path of Kriya, that is why we always even do this Kriya Pranayam in the cycles of 12 repetitions. Here we talk about how 1/2 a minute of revolution is 1 natural year of spiritual living, and in the same way, 6 minutes of Kriya, or rather 12 repetitions of Kriya, is 12 years of right spiritual living. And that is generally the way we practice the Kriya technique. We practice this particular pranayam in cycles of 12 because what we do in each cycle is we go through one particular progression in that spiritual journey, and we reach a point where if we want to, we can push it further and expand even a little bit more. So with every cycle of 12 Kriya repetitions and with every 12 years in our own life of spiritual living, we reach a point of spiritual growth and spiritual expansion. And that is how it influences, that is how the planet Jupiter or the Guru takes us forward in our own spiritual journey. In 3 years, a Kriya Yogi can thus accomplish by intelligent self-effort the same result which nature brings to pass in 1,000,000 years. The Kriya shortcut, of course, can be taken only by deeply developed yogis. With the guidance of a guru, such yogis have carefully prepared their bodies and brains to receive the power created by intensive practice. Now, that's some promise. To say that in 3 years of Kriya practice, you can achieve 1,000,000 years of spiritual evolution is something coming from an avatar like Paramahansa Yogananda. Whether we can really do that, like he's saying, is dependent on our own intensity, our own willpower, and what we are actually able to handle. But whether or not we actually achieve 1,000,000 years of evolution in 3 years, you can sure know that we certainly grow a lot more than we would just be able to without a practice like Kriya, just with natural spiritual living. So, Kriya Yoga is an airplane route to God. When we start working with subtle energies, we are talking about Kriya as a specific technique that came to us through this lineage of gurus. But in essence, what we are talking about is a practice of meditation, going deeper, working with prana directly, developing subtle awareness of our own energies, working with these energy centers in our astral spine. Of course, we want to do it with the guidance of a teacher, a deeply developed yogi who can tell us what is the right way to do and what will and won't work. When we are able to practice such a technique, when we are able to move that energy in an intelligent way through self-effort, through the astral spine, the spiritual evolution and progress that we can gain for ourselves is infinite. I mean, compared to 3, what is million? It's almost infinite. The way we grow is incredible with a practice like this. That is why in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna counsels Arjuna, even a little practice of this inward religion will free him from dire fears and colossal suffering. I hope that was helpful. Next week, I'll meet you with another topic. We'll talk more about Ida, Pingala, the physical breath, and what all of these energy channels mean for us in the path of Kriya Yoga. Until then, God bless you all.